The author of Chasdei David continues to summarize the teachings of the Arizal with the following insights. Uvamakom hahu ha'etzil et kol ha'olamot. And inside that place, i.e., the place where the Tzimtzum occurred, the Creator proceeded to create all of the worlds. Ve'atzimtzum hu shorosh hadin. And the act of the Tzimtzum was the root of all the dinim, that is to say, of all the harsh judgments. Reshimu nithavu hakelim. And from the Reshimu, a word which we'll define as we go along, the vessels were created. But of course, we'll explain all of these different concepts one by one as we go along. Having taught us that as a result of the Tzimtzum, the Halal was created, which is the empty place from where the infinite powers of the Creator were, so to speak, restricted from, we now continue to learn that inside that empty halal, the Creator proceeded to create all of the worlds that He would eventually create, each and every world in its proper turn. And although in the Zohar and in the writings of the Arizal we find mention of thousands and even myriads of spiritual worlds, nevertheless, more often than not, the Arizal divides all of these worlds into only 5 general worlds, which obviously means that all of the other worlds are merely private details of these 5 general worlds. So what are these 5 general worlds? The Zohar calls the first world Adam Kadmon, a term we'll have to define very, very diligently in the near future. In the meantime, though, we'll translate the term Adam Kadmon as the first Adam, or literally, the first man. And of course, the reason why this world is called first is obvious, as no other world preceded Adam Kadmon. However, in order to properly understand why this first world is referred to as Adam, which literally means man, requires a very lengthy discussion, which we'll soon undertake. And in doing so, we'll begin clarifying what the Torah really meant when it taught us that man was created in the image of God, i.e., B'Tselem Elokim. However, before we clarify all of these details, we'll first mention that after Adam Kadmon, which as we mentioned was the very first world to be created, then came the world which is known as Olam HaAtzilut. And since you're probably wondering what the term Atzilut means, I'll tell you that Atzilut could be explained in more than one way. One way to explain Atzilut is in relation to the term Atzil, which means important or elevated. The way we would refer to an important person as an Atzil, or to his important family as Atzula. Another way we could explain the term Atzilut is from the root Etzel. That is to say, close to or next to. As after all, Olam HaAtzilut is very, very close to the Creator, since there is only one world that separates between Olam HaAtzilut and the Creator, and that's Adam Kadmon, as we learned. And after Olam HaAtzilut came the bottom 3 worlds that are known as Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiah. And yes, the last and bottommost world is Olam HaAsiah, which is actually the world in which we live in. Or more precisely, it is the very end of Olam HaAsiah in which we live in, as we'll demonstrate and illustrate in great depth in the upcoming future. The next point which the author makes needs much more elucidation. The Tzimtzum hu shorosh hadin, and the act of the Tzimtzum is the root of all the dinim. To be honest with you, the Kabbalistic concept known as dinim is one of the hardest concepts to accurately translate to the English language. But perhaps we could loosely refer to dinim as the harsh judgments that come down from the spiritual worlds. However, perhaps it would be even more accurate to think of dinim as the direct opposite of the measure of chesed, which we can accurately translate as the godly measure of benevolence. If so, that means that dinim are the opposite of benevolence. Another striking difficulty with the statement that the Tzimtzum was the root of all the dinim is the fact that in the Zohar and the writings of the Arizal, we find that the dinim actually began to be revealed only in the bottom of Olam HaAtzilut. If so, what could the author possibly have meant here when he told us that the Tzimtzum was the root of all the dinim? After all, Olam HaAtzilut wasn't around yet when the Tzimtzum occurred. However, once we pay more careful attention to what we are actually saying here, we'll notice that we are not really speaking about the actual dinim that became revealed only later on in the bottom of Olam HaAtzilut, but rather about the root of the dinim, or more accurately, about the root of the root of the root of the dinim. After all, before the creation of the worlds, there was only one infinite existence of the Ein Sof, and certainly the Ein Sof's nature was one of infinite chesed and benevolence, which obviously leaves no room whatsoever for the existence of any dinim before the worlds were actually created. And that would explain why the Zohar and the Arizal teach us that the actual dinim were revealed only much later on, in the bottom of Olam HaAtzilut. So what did the author mean here when he told us that the Tzimtzum was the root of all the dinim? In order to understand this very deep concept, we must concede that in fact the concept of Tzimtzum is somewhat related to the concept of din. How so? When we take to heart that as a result of the Tzimtzum a totally new reality was created, namely the empty void halal from which the infinite powers of the Ein Sof were restricted from, if so, we must conclude that in one way or another, the Tzimtzum marked the dividing point between two completely opposite realities, between the infinite creator on the one hand, and all the future finite creations that were destined to be created inside of that empty halal. Having said all of that, we should now be able to appreciate that although certainly the concept of din cannot be equated with the infinitely benevolent creator, nevertheless, once that Tzimtzum did occur in the Ein Sof, we can indeed suggest that at least the root of all the dinim was revealed at that point. However, the actual dinim were revealed only at a much later stage, in the bottom of Olam HaAtzilut, as clarified in the Zohar and the writings of the Arizal. The rule of thumb for all of the above is as follows. With each and every world that the Creator proceeded to emanate within the empty halal that resulted after the Tzimtzum, the root of the dinim was revealed more and became stronger and stronger, until at a certain point, what initially was only the root of the dinim grew into proper dinim that act side by side with the chesed that was there all along. And in order to illustrate to you step by step the order in which the dinim became revealed, from their very first root in the Tzimtzum, and all the way up to their actual revelation and prominence as the worlds continued to be emanated within the halal, I therefore chose the color white to represent the chesed that predominated before the dinim were actually revealed. And as we'll soon see, the dinim will be represented by the color red. And towards the latter parts of our illustration, we'll also clarify where the impure kalipot that make up the Sitra Achara, literally the other side, came from. And as we'll see later on, these impure kalipot will be represented by the color black. And with that color box in mind, we'll begin by restating what we already alluded to before. Namely, that in the very first world known as Adam Kadmon, the dinim were not revealed at all. For that reason, I decided to omit Adam Kadmon from our illustration entirely, since for all intents and purposes, it was not a noticeable factor in the progressive revelation of the dinim. However, in the second world, known as Olam HaAtzilut, we do find the first revelation of the dinim. Therefore, in Olam HaAtzilut, we can see how the white chesed is gradually becoming intermixed with the color red of the oncoming dinim as they became more and more revealed in that world. And to be more specific, the Zohar states that in the Sephirah called Binah of Olam HaAtzilut, the dinim began to awaken. However, it was only from the Sephirah called Gevurah and onwards that the dinim were actually revealed in Olam HaAtzilut. And this is certainly the correct time to clarify that these dinim, which are beginning to be revealed in Olam HaAtzilut, are strictly dinim from the side of purity and kedusha, and not from the impure sitra achara, God forbid. And this is what David HaMelech wanted to convey to us when he alluded to Olam HaAtzilut in Sefer Tehillim in the verse Ki lo el chafetz resha ata lo yiguracha ra. Simply understood, in that verse, David HaMelech was praising God for his resentment of evil, to the point that he does not allow anyone or anything evil to enter his midst, or as David HaMelech put it, his neighborhood. However, with regards to our current discussion, we are more interested in the secret that David HaMelech was alluding to in that verse. David HaMelech was actually praising Olam HaAtzilut, which is also known as the world of godliness, Olam HaElokut, for the fact that although we do find some dinim in Olam HaAtzilut, nevertheless, none of these dinim are part of the evil side of impurity, as after all, by definition, we do not find any evil in his midst. Lo yiguracha ra, and Olam HaAtzilut is God's proverbial neighborhood, as we have explained. If so, how should we understand the nature and purpose of the dinim in Olam HaAtzilut? Well, you should know that all the dinim in Olam HaAtzilut are holy dinim whose main purpose is to demonstrate how great and how mighty the Creator really is. Additionally, these dinim eventually make their way all the way down here to Olam HaAsiah, in which man lives, which requires of us to understand the purpose of these dinim with regards to man. But in fact, it goes without saying that the existence of these dinim are what arouse us to repent and draw closer and closer to the Almighty, much the way a loving father will occasionally strike his beloved son in order to keep his behavior in check. And since at the end of the day, we understand how these dinim are intended to draw us towards the side of holiness, it is therefore only natural to understand that they obviously come from the side of holiness and not from the impure sitra achara, whose main purpose is to hide the Creator and His holiness in the world that He Himself created. And of course, at the end of the day, even that is for the purpose of man, in order to test our belief in God's existence, as well as our allegiance to the Torah lifestyle in lieu of the sitra achara's continuous temptations. However, it is only regarding Olam HaAtzilut that we can say that all the dinim in that world are strictly from the side of holiness, as from Olam Beriyah and onwards, things began to change. How so? Because from then on, from Olam Beriyah onwards, to go along with the chesed that is represented by the color white, and along with the dinim that are represented by the color red, now we also find the very first appearance of the impure kelipot that make up the sitra achara, as represented in our illustration by the color black. And this would obviously be the proper time to ask, where did the klipot that make up the impure sitra achara come from? The truth is that the entire side of impurity, known as the sitra achara, came out of the holy dinim that belong to the side of purity. More accurately though, the Kabbalists point out that the sitra achara is actually the waste or the residue that eventually came out of the holy dinim that began to be revealed in the bottom of Olam HaAtzilut. But how do we understand this very unusual concept? What did the Kabbalists mean when they said that the impure sitra achara is the waste and the residue of the pure dinim? Perhaps we can explain things in the following way. It is well known that the term Elohim means dinim or powers or might everywhere it is mentioned in the Torah, sometimes favorably, as when referring to the godly powers which are the dinim that come out of the side of purity, and sometimes unfavorably, as when referring to the powers of the impure sitra achara or idolatry. Yet we should all know that the Arizal points out that in truth, all forms of Elohim are actually connected to each other in what could be described as a proverbial chain, so to speak. At the top of that chain, we find the highest and purest dinim that are often referred to as Elohim Chayim, literally the living God. While at the bottom of this proverbial chain we find the lowest and most impure dinim that are referred to as Elohim Acherim, literally foreign gods, and certainly idolatry is the pinnacle of impurity. Similarly, this was also the phenomenon with the wicked Esav, who we know was the embodiment of the Sitra Achara in a human body. And where, or more accurately, from who did Esav come from? From none other than Yitzchak Avinu, of course, who, as we know, was notorious for embodying the measure of Gevurah in serving the Almighty. And for all intents and purposes, the measure of Gevurah is almost synonymous with the concept of Din. If so, then we find that the Sitra Achara that was embodied in Esav actually came out of the Dinim that were embodied in Yitzchak. Or according to what we just learned, we could explain that the Sitra Achara in Esav was actually the waste or the residue of the pure Dinim that were in Yitzchak. And of course, based on our previous introduction, we, more than anyone else, can appreciate why this was the case with the wicked Esav that came out of the righteous Yitzchak Avinu. And it goes without saying that Yaakov Avinu, who also came out of Yitzchak, took only the good parts of Yitzchak Avinu's dinim, what helped Yaakov become the greatest of all the three forefathers that started off our Jewish nation, as Yaakov, more than anyone else, exemplified the perfect balance between Chesed and Gevurah in serving the Almighty. Returning to our earlier discussion, it should be pointed out that the powers of the Sitra Achara in the worlds were intentionally revealed very, very gradually. How gradually? In Olam Beriyah, where the Sitra Achara first appeared, we actually find very little control by the side of impurity, compared to the majority influence that the side of purity and Kedusha has there. Therefore, I purposely illustrated only a very small amount of the color black compared to the other colors which represent the Chesed and the pure Dinim. However, in Olam HaYetzirah, the powers of impurity grew stronger, till the point that half of Olam HaYetzirah is controlled by the powers of the impure Sitra Achara, while the other half is still controlled by the powers of purity and Kedusha. Therefore, in Olam HaYetzirah, I purposely illustrated an equal distribution between the color black and the other colors that represent the powers of purity. However, once we get all the way down to Olam HaAsiyah, we find that the control of the Sitra Achara becomes very, very great, till the point that we could safely claim that the majority of Olam HaAsiyah is comprised of the impure Sitra Achara, while only a minority of that bottom world is comprised of the side of purity. Therefore, in Olam HaAsiyah, I illustrated a very large amount of the color black compared to very little of the other colors that represent the powers of purity. And it should also be pointed out that in our more recent generations, in the foothills of Mashiach, the amount of evil and impurity in the world has increased much, much more than in the previous generations, to the point that the Kabbalists say that nowadays we are, so to speak, inside the proverbial belly of the snake, a term that they use in order to impress upon us the great amount of impurity which we are currently mired in. And even so, you should know that there is actually yet another region besides all of the above-mentioned worlds, which is situated below Olam HaAsiyah. This region is known as Mador HaKelipot, literally, the domain of the Klipot, which make up the evil Sitra Achara. And since, as we've mentioned, this region is situated below Olam HaAsiyah, therefore it is often referred to as just that, the region below Olam HaAsiyah. And since in this region only the impure Sitra Achara is to be found, therefore in our current illustration we see only the color black predominating, to the complete exclusion of all the other colors that represent the side of purity and Kedusha. And so that we won't forget how we got to this stage, I'll remind our viewers that the reason for which we began our recent trip through the worlds was the ambiguous statement that the author made, namely that the Tzimtzum was the root of the dinim. Therefore, in order to better appreciate this somewhat ambiguous statement, I wanted to impress upon you by means of our colorful illustration how and why the Tzimtzum is referred to as the root of the dinim. And in the next step, we learn how the root of the dinim eventually grew into actual revealed dinim, which became more and more prominent with each and every world that came into the scene. And in the final stages of our illustration, we learn how even the Sitra Achara branched out of the pure dinim, albeit as the waste or the residue of these dinim. And in case you still haven't picked up on my intention, I wanted to impress upon you that besides being the root of all the dinim, the Tzimtzum was also the root of all the evil and all the impurity that would later on be revealed in the bottom three worlds, and mostly in Olam Asiah. But in truth, that shouldn't really surprise us all that much, since we know intuitively that everything must surely have come from the Creator, even the snake in Gan Eden, and therefore even the Klipot. The next thing that the author clarifies for us is Reshimu nithavu hakelim. The vessels were created from the Reshimu, which we'll soon define. This sentence should be viewed as a sort of an introduction to the next section of our learning, in which we'll be discussing in great depth how the worlds were created and in what order. Therefore, as an introduction to that, we are first informed about the secret known as the Reshimu. So what is the Reshimu? The Reshimu is a term that refers to the thin presence that remained inside the Halal even after the Ein Sof restricted his infinite powers inside that place. And in case you haven't figured out the implication of what we're saying here, I'll spell it out for you. The existence of the Reshimu is a clear indication that the famous Tzimtzum was not actually a complete restriction of the Ein Sof within the Halal like we thought it was. And although in his book Etz Chaim, the Arizal taught us that as a result of the Tzimtzum, an empty space was created, what the Arizal termed there Halal ve'avir reikan. Nevertheless, in a different book, the Arizal clarifies that in truth, the Ein Sof did not restrict his light completely from the area of the Tzimtzum. And indeed, what remained inside the Halal, even after the Tzimtzum, is the Reshimu that we are currently learning about. And it should be noted that there is actually a very relevant connection between our current statement that the vessels were created from the Reshimu and the previous thing that we just learned, namely, how the Tzimtzum was the root of all the dinim. What's the connection? When we carefully inspect the concept of a vessel, it shouldn't take us long to understand that in truth, nothing represents dinim more than the concept of a vessel. How so? Due to the fact that the primary function of a vessel is to contain and to limit a particular measure within it, and no more than that measure. On the other hand, the concept of chesed does just the opposite, as by definition chesed tends to bestow goodness without any limits or measures. The measure of din, however, by definition limits how much goodness is bestowed and to whom that goodness is bestowed upon. This is why the concept of a vessel is almost synonymous with the concept of measure or limitation. And it is no secret that although the most literal translation of the term vessel is keli, nevertheless, our sages often use the term midah instead, which literally means measure. This is why in Masechet Menachot, when the sages of the Mishnah enumerated various vessels that were used in the Beit HaMikdash, they purposely used the term midot, as the Mishnah there states, there were 7 midot for liquids in the temple. Hin, half a hin, a third of a hin, a quarter of a hin, log, half a log, and a quarter of a log. However, what must be pointed out here is that although we were just taught what seemed to be a very general statement that the vessels were formed from the Reshimu, Nevertheless, this statement is actually applicable only to the vessels of the very first world, called Adam Kadmon. However, the vessels of all the other ensuing worlds, Atzilut, Beriyah, Yetzirah, and Asiah, were formed in a later on stage and in a different fashion, as clarified in the writings of the Arizal. And if you'll ask, what are these vessels of Adam Kadmon, and exactly how were they created from the above-mentioned Reshimu? I'll have to preempt that concepts such as the Reshimu and the vessels of Adam Kadmon are some of the loftiest and most ethereal concepts there could be, and it is therefore very, very difficult to speak accurately about these almost far-fetched spiritual plateaus. However, since we have to say something regarding these lofty concepts, then we'll take the allegoric liberty to describe the vessels that were formed by the Reshimu as empty pipes, so to speak, or as dry riverbeds that were formed when the Ein Sof restricted himself from the place of the Tzimtzum, i.e. from the Halal. And in the next section of our learning, we'll describe in great depth how these empty vessels were later on refilled with light, much like the waters that return to the dry riverbeds during the rainy season. And it should also be noted that all of Adam Kadmon's vessels were created from that residual Reshimu, not only the vessels of the circular distinction known as the Igulim, but also the vessels of the linear distinction known as the Ve-Yosher. And although we haven't yet spoken about either distinction of vessels, nevertheless, before long we'll surely define and elaborate in great depth about the two distinctions called Igulim and Ve-Yosher as we progress together in our learning. In the meantime, though, let it be noted that both types of Adam Kadmon's vessels were formed from the residual Reshimu that remained inside the Halal even after the Tzimtzum.